Hello, everybody, and welcome to an interview today with Dr. Vera Tarman. You probably know Dr. Vera Tarman if you've at all been working in this space, but Dr. Tarman is the author of the book Food Junkies. She is a medical doctor, actually, with expertise in addiction recovery. She's the director of an addictions recovery center in Toronto, Canada, that is called Renascent. She also has her own sugar food addiction YouTube channel. She also is the co-host of a podcast called Food Junkies, which also deals with the theme of food addiction and sugar addiction. And she has a Facebook group called I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar-Free for Life support group. So she's really actively involved in this space, both professionally as a doctor with expertise in addiction recovery, but she also has her own journey of recovery. She's lost 100 pounds, kept it off for 12 years, and she did it because she stumbled on the information that food can be addictive. She embraced the concept of abstinence completely, transformed her life, and now she's on a mission and spreading the word that these foods are not just detrimental to our bodies and minds. They can be addictive, and that the journey of unhooking from them requires some nuanced understanding of how to work with addiction so that people can be set up for long-term success. So we share this mission, and we're here to share the latest information, the latest activities of Dr. Tarman, and thank you for being here.
Thank you again for asking. I always love to come.
So we were talking before we got the camera rolling that there's a couple of themes that we wanted to touch on in this interview today. And the first one is there was this huge, groundbreaking international conference that took place in England that Dr. Tarman was there and was actively involved in. So she's going to bring some of the highlights of what's happening on the international stage around trying to get the DSM at this point. Is it also the UCD? Would you say?
Yeah, both.
Yeah, or ICD, I'm sorry. The DSM and the ICD to recognize, ultra processed food or food addiction or sugar addiction, however we want to call it, as a bona fide legitimate addiction, substance abuse disorder, that it qualifies as that and requires targeted interventions and not just medical screening and treatment, but also that it's covered. It's covered through people's insurance plans so that it's more accessible for the mainstream. So we'll talk a bit about that and some of the groundwork happening there. And then we're going to talk a bit about Dr. Tarman has a published paper about the stages of food addiction, which is fascinating. So let's kick it off with what took place over there in the UK.
Okay, thank you, Florence. So in May of 2024, basically the people that have been writing and speaking in the field of food addiction, as many as could, I mean, you're obviously one of those people, but you couldn't make it, got together in the UK. And it was a conference called the International Food Addiction Consensus Conference. And what it was there to do was to sort of draw upon what do we all agree upon in the world of food addiction so that we can present a unified front. And first and foremost is the definition of food addiction. Should we call it sugar addiction, processed food addiction, ultra processed food addiction, or just food addiction or sugar addiction? What should we call it? Because everybody has their own take on it. And as long as we are individual units, we're not going to present a unified front, which is really important with the ICD and the DSM approval process, because they need to know what is it that we're addicted to. Like, is it all of those things? Is it one of those things, two of those things? And there was an attempt to make a consensus. And we, through a process of polling and interviewing and focus groups, I'm part of that consensus, but I didn't draw this all together. They came up with the consensus that we are going to call an ultra-processed food addiction. And this conference was to announce that finding and then give some various talks to support that. And that's what the conference was. I think there have been various food addiction conferences in the past, but this is the first one that's drawn some of the key players in the field all together with this idea of consensus, not unified, like sort of individual discrete pieces. So we came up with the concept of ultra processed food addiction, as that is the consensus. Now, we all know with consensus, that doesn't necessarily mean everybody agrees to the nth degree. It's a compromise. I guess we should call it a compromise consensus. Because, for example, I'm not keen on the word ultra processed food addiction, but I signed on the dotted line because I was persuaded that that was the best way to go. I'm going to close that window. Sorry, just a pause.
Absolutely. No problem. Take your time.
I'm just afraid that somebody's going to work on their deck, and that's all we're going to hear. Okay, getting back to there. Yeah, I'm not a fan of a total believer of the word ultra processed food addiction, because I think it's more than just that. But I'm an expedient thinker, and I think that many of the people on the committee were as well. And we decided that ultra processed food addiction absolutely is part of the addictive profile. There's very few people that are addicted to other things and not ultra processed food. It's often the entry point, and then it can flourish and develop beyond that. So if we have to find something that is in common ground everywhere, and I'm very much a let's find the common ground because we need to be unified, then that'll work. And my thinking is, this is why I'm willing to sign, even though I don't think it's the perfect terminology, is that once we're in there, in that damn DSM or the ICD as ultra processed food addiction, there's nothing to stop people from then saying subcategory volume addiction, subcategory sugar addiction, which you can be addicted to sugar. That's not ultra processed food. You can make your own cake or some kind of product in your kitchen. That's not ultra processed, because ultra processed by definition means it includes ingredients that I cannot make. It's industrial foods. So it's not accurate, but it's a good start. And I think a lot of us who feel like it's not totally accurate see that there are ways to maneuver this once it's in. But if we stay stuck with, oh, it's ultra processed food, or it's sugar, or in my version, it's everything, let's call it food addiction, we're going to get nowhere. We've already been doing that agenda. It's gotten nowhere. And we made sure we invited, I'm giving you a very long answer. I hope this is okay.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
We invited people like Chris Van Tulleken, because he wrote this amazing book that is a bestseller called Ultra Processed People. So we're already hearing that terminology in there. And a lot of people are like, yeah, I can buy that. I'm not sure about food addiction, but I can buy ultra, because we know it's not even food. It's not even food. So how can we not be damaged by that? And part of that damage is addiction. People, it's an easy buy compared to me saying there's such a thing as volume addiction. Or other people going, what are you talking about? We can sell that one. So that's why we came up with that definition. And I know it's not perfect, but I think it's going to work.
I completely agree. I actually love the term, because I think you're right. People resonate with, no one needs to be eating ultra processed foods.
Yeah.
No one. It doesn't even sound good. Something in our bodies go, that's not right. And
I just came across an article, and I'm actually going to hunt that person down to do a podcast and talk with them specifically, because it's really interesting. You might want to pursue her too. It's an article that was published just in the last few months, which, by the way, folks, there is so much stuff being published now because ultra processed food is palatable. People can get this. There's so much being published now about addiction and ultra processed food. How
it's explosive.
Yeah. But anyway, I think we're in this year is the tipping point, the final tipping point that we've all been waiting for. Anyway, This was an article that said, I think it's called No Food or Not Food. The truth about let's call it ultra processed product. Don't even have the word food in it, because it's not food. And when you think of it that way, it's like, it makes it very easy to see that this is, but not food. I'm even taking to, even though it's not an accurate term or accurate, it does give the image. I'm even saying, imagine eating microplastic. It's basically how can that be good for you? No, microplastic with flavoring, because I think it's Michael Moss who writes in his book, if it didn't have the flavoring, it would taste like SHIT. It would just taste horrible. It would not taste like food, because it isn't food. It's the flavoring that makes it taste like food, but it isn't food. So let's just call it ultra processed product. Anyway, I think that's a great article to hunt down. point being made that it isn't food.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely not. It's as much food as heroin and morphine used to be a poppy seed.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
started originally
Or not
somewhere.
even, because how about not even that, but what we've done is we've taken the poppy seed or the chemical signature of what's in the poppy seed, the morphine, and we have made an artificial version of that.
Ah.
Like, for example, crystal meth is entirely fabricated. I mean, there's nothing natural in that, but it mimics a very, 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 very potent cocaine high. There's not even any coca anymore. It's entirely fabricated. That's what we're talking about with ultra processed food. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
if anybody is interested in this, can I just do a quick sell? The talks on the UK are available for fairly reasonable price. I think like $50 American, something like that, and you get like 8 or 10 talks from leading people in the field, including Michael Moss and no, not Moss, Chris Van Tolikin, and yeah, Michael Moss was there too, him too, and me. You can hear me here, but nevertheless.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the good thing about buying those recordings, beyond the fact that you get to be right on the cutting edge of history in the making, as world experts come together to talk about how can we get this on the radar, medical, establishments radar, so we can diagnose it and treat it and cover it under medical plans.
Yeah.
But you're also supporting the work of people who are spending enormous amounts of time, for free, working on this genuine social justice issue.
That's true. All of those people, it's entirely voluntary, and all of the funds are to promote either the efforts to get this thing in the DSM or for the next conference, which, by the way, will be in Mexico next year.
Hardly wait. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be just got to get those dates to me early so I book it off. Yeah, and I really do see this topic that we're talking about as social justice. Certainly there's biomedical, psychological implications of the consumption of ultra-processed foods, junk foods, but there's also a profound social justice issue in the sense that if these foods are addictive, and certainly there's an ocean of evidence and more coming all the time that they can be, no different than any other substances of use and abuse, it really begs the question, should we be protecting children under the age of 18?
Yes. Oh my God. Yes, absolutely.
Any adult in most countries would say yes, because we protect them from pornography, from alcohol, from drugs, we're trying to protect them from vaping now. We're trying to protect them from substances as their brains are developing, from known addictive substances. Most countries have policies in place between the ages of 18 and 21. So it really begs that question. It's a social justice issue. Are we doing enough to protect children from these non-food, absolutely biochemically damaging substances, but potentially can also be addictive? And then the other social justice issue is that it causes such extraordinary suffering. And if people are caught up in all the different ways that it has infiltrated our food culture, it's causing all this suffering. How is it different than any other sort of pandemic or epidemic? Or it isn't. So we need to come together like we did around COVID and really put our heads together and go, how can we get policies in place? How can we collaborate to get our food culture back where it needs to be so that we're eating mostly whole foods most of the time?
Yeah. We don't want to do it the COVID way because that got such a backlash. But the tobacco way worked really well. I mean, now, you feel like a pariah when you're a smoker. And my goal is one day that people will feel like a pariah when they order that dessert or they bring a dessert to something and tell people, and I know that's going to...
It's coming.
Yeah.
And it is coming. It is coming. And maybe they don't need to feel like a pariah exactly, but they'll feel really awkward because they'll be the only one at the table who's ordering dessert while everyone else is like, can I have the berries, please?
Yeah, exactly. Can I have the berries? Yeah, exactly. All right. They don't have to feel like a pariah.
So the other thing I wanted to say about this conference is that there's also the beginning of a collaboration around the the paths forward, like how to help people get out of being hooked onto these ultra processed foods. And, slowly we're starting to share and collaborate on different approaches that, different sort of standards of care that people can implement. There's more than one right way of walking your way out of an addiction, and there's lots of different things that have to come together. So that's really exciting as well.
Yeah, and that's partly the presentation that I presented, or the article that I published. I wanted to publish that because I wanted something in the literature that talked about the different stages, which then invite the different types of treatment. Because it makes sense that if somebody is, if somebody's going to say, why is it that I can't eat this, but so and so can eat this, or why is it that I can't eat this anymore and I used to be able to in the past? Because you're in a different stage now. It's a chronic progressive condition, and you're worse now, essentially, or that other person is just in a different stage. And although that's not an idea unique to me by any means, I mean, Phil Wardell has been talking about that since the 80s. A lot of us have been talking about that. May not have used those words, but that idea. But I couldn't find anything in the literature that actually said that. So I just wanted to have something in the literature that people could then refer to. I don't know if they will, but at least there's something there now that people can say, yeah, okay, based, because often people aren't going to use information unless there's some kind of science that backs it up. So this is a sort of opinion piece that invites further research or to start from there and move on. And I hope it works for that reason, because it explains why there are different treatment paradigms that work for different people.
That's amazing. And I'd love to go there. And I just wanted to add that stage 2 cancer is different than stage 4.
Yes.
Different interventions.
Yes.
Pre-diabetes is still on the diabetes spectrum, but it's a different stage. It's potentially a different intervention, slightly.
Yes.
Maybe you can tolerate a few more carbs than you can once you're fully diabetic, right?
Stage 2 cancer, whichever type it is, sometimes it actually represents an entirely different type of cancer. Let's say we're talking breast cancer. A stage 2 that is very slow and progressive is a slightly different cancer than one that's earlier on and more rapidly progressive. So it may actually invite a slightly different, maybe even a different DNA signature. We don't know that. But it means that my food addiction may be at a different level than yours, or it may actually be a different type of food addiction. We don't know, but at least staging it like that invites those, like you said, comparisons with other illnesses.
Totally interesting. Yeah. Take us away. Go tell us about the stages of ultra processed food addiction.
I'll say, like I said, a lot of it is intuitive and has already been done. And really all I did was synthesize kind of common knowledge. And I tried to give some, the basis of what I said is, look, this is what we've been doing clinically. And I used Phil Wardell as an example because he's been a pioneer in the field, which, by the way, he just passed away last year. But he's been a pioneer in the field of food addiction since the 80s. And a lot of us were trained by him or became aware of his information. But he didn't have enough sort of scientific basis, although he did a lot of his own writing. And then I thought, okay, let's tie this with stuff that we already know in the addiction field, which was the sort of Kubian and Kub's model. Kub being one of the leading people in the American Society of Addiction Medicine, writing about the model of addiction. How does a person, whatever the addiction is, nicotine or cocaine or alcohol, how does a person develop the beginning, and how does that morph into something that is truly addictive and damaging to the person? And so it's a neurobiological adaptation. And so I thought that neuroadaptation applies very nicely to what we see with food addiction clinically. And then I tied Carolyn Davis, who actually is a Canadian, who talked about early days, also in the 80s, 90s, I think it was more 90s, who talked about, she was in the eating disorder field looking at food behavior and said, this looks like addiction to me. Is this a neuroadaptation? She didn't talk about Kubes, but that was the type of thinking that is happening. And so I just sort of tied all those together and said, yeah, this looks like this is what's happening. And it's a gradual progression of neuroadaptation from the dopamine receptors, because it's basically dopamine. Of course, it's more than dopamine, but that is the addiction piece of it, or the biological piece is the dopamine. and that there's a gradual adaptation, and that is, although it's a continuum, there appear to be discrete stages, which is what Bordell talked about, stages, clinical stages that we see. Like he said, I call it early. He said pre-addiction. You're just eating processed foods, highly processed foods, which are addictive. Nobody can eat that stuff and just have one chip. Like if they do, that means that the food industry has failed in its job to make you have more than, quote, more than just one. That doesn't mean you're addicted. It just means that you're following the dictate of the food industry. But then as you continue to eat that stuff, there's a gradual neuroadaptation that happens, and this is an early stage, and then a middle stage, and an end stage. And at some point, there's a line a person crosses. This is Kube's thinking, where you eat not for the pleasure anymore, but to avoid the discomfort of withdrawal, of stopping. And when that happens, now you're into late and final stage of food addiction. And that's when, Florence, we see people, and I talk about abstinence as well, but we see people who cannot have even one, because if they have one, they want more. Early stage, you might be able to have on your birthday your treat that you think you need. But at a particular stage, when you cross the line, no more treats of that nature, because it's not a treat anymore. You're walking into hell. And what is that line? Kubes has a thing, he calls it hypercataphia. It's a moment when you're using for avoidance of pain rather than for pleasure. That when you've reached that point, you're into a later stage of food addiction. So anyway, that's what the paper is about. And my presentation that I did on that day, on May 17th, I think it was to talk about why is abstinence so important? And it's that point when you cross the line. And I think that when you reach that point, and most people know, they don't want to know, but they know, if I have that's I'm in trouble. That means you've crossed that line. And he makes the argument, as do I, well, because I see it clinically, that even when a person has stopped for a while, 6 months, a year, you might say, well, maybe I can have a little bit now. It's been a year. But some of those changes persist even into sobriety. And that's why you can't have one even 10 years later. Well, you might be able to have one, but something gets stirred up. And there's more to say about that. Like, I'd love to write more about this. Well, I'm hoping that I'm hoping that the conference will invite an actual publication, and then I will write more about it then. Because if I can just say this too, Florence, I really wanted to speak about abstinence at this conference because I knew it was a consensus conference, and I thought there are so much thinking about, like some of the people that were there, like Robert Lustig and Nicole Aguina, absolutely essential voices in the field, but I don't know if they're entirely convinced that abstinence is essential. I think they get it, but I don't know if they get it completely. And I wanted one voice, it's going to be me, that says, for some of us, it is essential. And here's why. So I wanted that there so that in the future, that word doesn't get lost, because there's a lot of harm reduction talk. And I get that, because you don't want to scare people away. And if people are struggling, you want to support them. But I want it to be known that if you want true peace and you are at that later stage, that's why stages are important. That's the only way you're going to get it.
Amazing. So as
you and I agree on that.
And I do completely. And what's coming up in my mind is a reminder that I probably need to do better screening around your 3 stages.
Yeah.
Because I am an abstinence-based coach, right?
Yes.
So I kind of come in and I'm upfront about it. Like, I'm assuming your goal is a breakup.
Yeah.
That you want to break up, like an ex-cigarette smoker who's just like, we're done. I want to fall in love with Whole Foods. I want to sail off into the sunset, and I want to have tools and strategies and support to do this long term.
Yeah.
But sometimes I have people coming into my programs for whom it's so hard, and they're so frustrated and demoralized by the fact that they keep having these slips.
Yeah.
And they know it's a part of recovery, and it happens. And every time they wind up in the ditch, there's something they learn. And they value that. It's considered research. And they're like, I really do need to plan my meals ahead, or I really do need to make sure I bring food to parties, or whatever.
Yeah.
They learn. But some of them at a certain point hit a wall where they're like, I'm just too tired fighting. Can you help me figure out what moderation might look like for me? Like, what does harm reduction look like? Can you teach me harm reduction? Can you at least help me with that? And then I'm like, kind of not really.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know what that looks like.
Okay, so then what you might need to do is determine, like you said, you have to screen. So one of the things I would really like to see from this article is a call for screening. So how can we determine where the fits are? Now, I know that Bitten Johnson, for example, has her sugar analysis, and that probably would tag somebody right into the later stage of food addiction because it's throughout their life. Because I think Florence, if you had some kind of screening tool, then you could say, okay, harm reduction, here's the value of that. But if you're hoping that that might be a sufficient solution and you're at late stage, it probably won't be. So this is a temporary fix. But maybe if you're not at that stage, then maybe a harm reduction tool will work for you. Moderation, let's call it moderation, will work for you. But if you're at a later stage, it won't. But then what a person would do in the harm reduction thing is, okay, what are you willing to do that it's not the best solution, but it's something, kind of like sweeteners. Are you willing to live with sweeteners? Okay, can we do that? Are you willing to cut back? And then you work with them. How well did that work? If you had the screening, though, you would know right off where that's likely to work and not work.
So I can imagine that there might be people listening to this going, okay. Tell me about how can I help decide for myself if I'm early stage, middle stage, or latter stage? Right. What kind of screening tools have we got now for that?
Well, I don't know if we have any other than Bitten Johnson's, which most likely would peg somebody into the later stage of food addiction. I think we do it on the seat of our pants by the client saying, you just ask the question, have you ever been able to moderate your food with peace? And when we talk about moderation, first of all, we want to know what we're talking about with moderation, because if it's just sugar, but you're still able to eat other processed foods, okay, then that would be your version of moderation. Whereas somebody else would say, no, I can't eat any processed food. So even though it's healthy, if it's packaged in some keto bar and I can't moderate that, then that's part of the deal. I usually just use the word sugar and trigger foods. But another one would be, can you tolerate sweetener? Another person couldn't tolerate that. So we've been doing it by the seat of our pants by figuring out what are the trigger foods. But I think it would be great if we actually had a specific tool. We don't have one yet. So far, it's Florence using her in the moment, spot on client intuition focus.
Yep.
Yeah.
So early stages is where you're consuming ultra-processed foods, and it's kind of like you're using them and maybe occasionally overdoing it a little bit, but it's kind of not really a major problem, not physically, not mentally, not in terms of volume.
Yeah, because, and really it's just a sign that the food industry has done its job. Like it is making you want to eat this stuff. That is its job. That food engineers are thinking, how can we make you choose more of me rather than another food? So it's not even really a condition, but you are getting triggered in a particular way.
Okay.
When the neuroadaptation happens because of overexposure, so if you really truly, if we all just had a dessert, even a super duper thing 3 times a year, nothing would happen. Like we used to feast, human beings used to feast all the time before the processed food industry came around, and only the rich who had the ability to feast every weekend had a problem because it was just not available or expensive, whatever. But now the food industry, we get to feast every day, and therefore overexposure of those dopamine spikes leads to a neuroadaptation, which ultimately translates to a change in the brain. Then we move from early stage of food addiction to the next stage. Like there's a true biological change that's happened. And now you're in a stage where you can't really moderate anymore, or the moderation is uncomfortable, as opposed to, I don't need, Christmas is over, I'm done. It was really nice while it lasted, but I'm done.
Yeah. Okay. So the early stage, it sounds like you're using, and then the second stage is there's abuse. There's some kind of
So you could have used the term recreational use, and then you could use the term misuse, and then abuse. Those are kind of the terms before. Like I said, this is not a new concept, but we haven't really used it. Like, I'd like to see a uniformity in the food addiction world about this terminology. Like, I think we all kind of get it, but because we don't really know the mechanism or agree on the mechanism, therefore.
Right. When does someone tip over from recreational use into being an abuser? So there's users, abusers, and addicts. So
More
when
or
does a
less,
user become an abuser? And when does an abuser become an addict? And
yeah.
maybe it's a bit fuzzy, that line,
Yeah.
but
And I think that line into addict is when it's what Kubes called that hyperkataphia, which he just basically meant a distress when you can't have your substance.
yes.
I'm using to avoid distress as opposed to gain pleasure. And that happens with every addiction. Every addiction. It becomes not fun anymore.
Right. I have a very clear memory of being 10 and I was living on a boat in the Caribbean.
Oh my gosh.
I remember, my father retired early and decided to buy a boat and sail around the world and dragged his wife and 3 kids, my younger 2 siblings, with me. And I would wake up to the sound. My bunk was at the top front of the boat, and I'd wake up to the sound of water sort of hitting the hull. And I'd kind of wake up. And back then, kids didn't develop that early. I kind of slept in my bikini bottom, and I woke up in my bikini bottom, and I would grab something to eat, and I would fly out the door to swim overboard and go to shore to see who was there to play with. And this particular morning, it was so memorable. But I got up, and I don't know where my parents were. They might have already had gone to shore or something. I might have slept in, but I recall being alone, and I was sort of hungry, but not really. So I grabbed something to eat. I don't recall what it was, but then there was this like craving for sugar.
Yeah.
And I couldn't put my finger on it. At the age of 10, there was no awareness around it, but I kind of rummaged through the cupboards to see what was there. And I was annoyed because there was a part of me going, I want to get to shore. Like, I want to go play. I want to go, like, where's my siblings? What's happening? And I felt left behind, and I wanted to go play, but there was something else that needed to be dealt with.
Yeah.
And I remember, so I got one of these no-bake cakes with this really disgusting frosting. And I remember eating it with resentment. Like, I was just like shoveling it in to shut up that what I would call the sugar dragon, or that it's right.
Yeah.
It's almost that moment where you're like, I don't even want this.
Yeah.
I just want whatever that thing that's crawling at me and bugging me to shut up.
Yeah.
Like, leave me alone. There, you've got your cake. Can I go play now? Kind of feeling. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. That would be one version of it. I mean, I'm thinking that it could be to the point of I'm, 400 pounds and I really have to stop, and I still can't stop. But you're giving like a very nice kids version of that, because they likely have not yet developed all those conditions, but they're still dealing with the dragon inside. Yeah.
That this itch that just needs to be scratched, and it's annoying, and it's not. There wasn't even pleasure; it was gross.
Yeah, and that itch, you weren't enjoying it exactly, but you kept thinking you have to do this. That's dopamine. That is the exact feeling of what a spiked dopamine is. And you see that in everything. Like when a person is smoking a cigarette or drinking, it's like, oh, I feel sick, I'm going to throw up. You still want it. Porn, it's still, you still want more, even though it's all over it. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. Addiction, it drives a person crazy when it's that itch that cannot be fulfilled.
Yeah, that's right. It's an itch that can't get satisfied, but you can't not itch it without feeling like you're going to lose your mind. So you're just like, okay, fine, I'm going to scratch it. And then you hope that it's temporarily assuaged, but it always comes back.
And when you stop, it hurts. It really hurts. It's like, oh my God, it hurts because you've been scratching so much. It hurts. The only way to abate that is by scratching more. Like, it's funny how you don't really feel the pain until you stop scratching. You just keep wanting that thing. Yeah. Anyway, when that moment happens, that's when you're in stage 4 or later stage. You're in the addictive stage.
In the addictive stage, yeah. Got it. So the middle stage, tell us a bit more about what that might look like.
I guess that would be when, it's a continuum. So definitely the obsession is there. I think it might be a painful stage because a person is still thinking it's not that bad. Like at the later stage, it's bad and you just can't stop it. But I guess the middle stage is you're not entirely convinced. You can still live. You can manage it to some degree. Maybe you can moderate once in a while, although I don't think moderation is a peaceful solution. It always feels like white knuckling. But maybe that would be it. It feels like white knuckling as opposed to I cannot live this way. Because when you're in the addiction, you can't win if you use and you can't win if you don't use. They both feel equally awful. Maybe it's not so awful to try to moderate. Like it doesn't feel comfortable, so you can't do it for long. But you're not like, no way am I going there. Because otherwise, like the end stage, I can't sleep if I don't have my substance. I can't function. I'm not happy. I don't want to do anything when I can't have my substance. Like you had that flash of when you were a child. You wanted to go somewhere, but you couldn't. You were held. But I would guess that was probably more middle because you were still able to stop and go off eventually, right?
Well, I ate the damn cake till I felt sick and I was annoyed and I resented it. And I'm like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Like, what is this?
Yeah.
Like
the end stage you'd still eat even though you were sick. That's the classic example of the person who is grazing or bulimic. You just keep eating. Like you just cannot stop.
Yeah.
Until you pass out or something like that. Like that actually happens for people.
I've had that happen.
Yeah.
Later. I mean, I could see by the time I was 10 that my sheer volume of exposure, plus I think my brain was sensitive. I'm sensitive in so many ways and I'm very sensitive to drug foods. But by the age of 10, I think I was already well into the adaptation phase.
Yeah.
It was just
it sounds like, would you agree with me that you were probably in middle stage and then developed to a later stage in your teens?
Yeah. Yeah. But I have certainly binged to the point of vomiting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was disgusting. And it was at that point, it was Whole Foods, it was blueberries, and I can't remember what else I had, but it was just like, I cannot stop. Like, what's wrong with me?
That's a really good example of how it's not just ultra processed food. It can be food too. Yeah.
I found that for me, my journey, the first thing that really came on my radar was sugar because I read the Sugar Blues and I had blinding migraines and I was depressed and I was overweight and I had cystic acne and I had this medical file like this. And if it wasn't one pharmaceutical, it's another. They were throwing at me like, oh my goodness. And there was some part of me that knew this isn't getting better. This isn't working.
No,
and especially with migraines, because when you're in the dark and you're miserable, I remember like holding my head thinking, I know you need something. I will do it. Just tell me. I couldn't get a beat on it till I read the Sugar Blues. So sugar was on my radar first. Yeah. And then I was kind of getting the sugar down and then the flour comes up. And then I'm like, what the hell? Okay, then, you get the flour down and then the cheese comes up and you're like, what the hell? And then you get the cheese down and then the nuts come up. And then, the fruit and you're like, I'm just playing whack-a-mole all bloody day. It's like my dragon just keeps, well, fine, you're not going to eat that. Well, then bring this in the back door. But the final frontier for me was the volume addiction. So at that point, I could volume eat on blueberries.
Yeah. And what's really sad about your story is that if you were in 2024 going into the medical world, the very same advice would be given to you then as you got now as you got then, because they still haven't cottoned on. And so they would still be after the medications and telling you all the advice that they gave you then that wasn't helpful for you. That's the sad
Wow. That's why we're doing what we're doing.
That's why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah. Right. Because someone could come in and screen and say, hey, honey, let's look at what you're eating. And let's see whether or not it's hooking you into behaviors that are just really annoying. Yeah. And let's see if we can get you some support, proper professional, quality support to get you unhooked and supported enough so that you can learn how to meet life without the really quick fix that these foods bring us, because they're really effective. Yeah. They're wonderful drugs. Fantastic. Yeah. I never needed a stronger drug. Thank God for me in my life, right? So I never needed anything stronger. Did you?
You didn't need to pick up heroin and cocaine.
I didn't.
No. You had already.
No, because it was so effective. And because I'd have these stretches of breaks as well, when I would go back to it, it'd be a fresh drug all over again, right? My tolerance had my
Exactly.
capacity.
Yeah, and you know that this your experience, because you developed this as a child, and again, if you were in today's world, there's a lot of people where they start the way that you did, like because of the exposure, like you were overly exposed as a child, as so many of our children are, and boy,
Mm-hmm.
do those other drugs that you didn't need. If you had stumbled upon them, boy, would they have worked. You would have become a very happy tobacco smoker, and then you would have picked up alcohol super easy and cocaine. Wow, that really suppresses my appetite. And you would have found I'm not a food addict because this stuff works. And I think that that's partly why we don't see food addiction for what it is. You, for some reason, didn't pick up those things. But if you had picked up those things, you wouldn't have cottoned on to the food. You would have been seeing me for your addictions, your other addictions, and like for your cocaine addiction and tobacco addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And then when we finally got off of that, guess what happened? Now we discover you're actually a food addict, not in disguise, but transferred. Yeah, I guess in disguise. It's underlying. It's a that dragon
Foundation.
was always there. How many people now in the addiction world? The dragon is just it's just waiting. The food is going to come. Yeah.
Totally. That's so insightful. And I think I got lucky that I didn't pick up other addictions for lots of reasons, but one of them was because everything gave me migraines.
Oh wow.
Right. Like I couldn't drink. I had horrible migraines and horrible
Wow.
hangovers, and I never tried any harder drugs,
Didn't
but
sugar give you
probably
a
because,
migraine?
what's that?
Didn't sugar give you a migraine?
Oh, horrible.
But you didn't stop that. Didn't matter.
Well, I was stopping it from the age of 20. I was
Okay. Okay.
making progress, but I kept slipping.
Got
I
it.
kept relapsing because
Exactly. No, I understand.
I didn't learn about the concept of abstinence till I was in my 30s.
Yeah, yeah, got it. I understand now. Yeah, I get it.
I was on again, off again, on again, off again, because I kept thinking, oh, it's been weeks. I probably can have a little.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the concept of abstinence, for many people, they're hearing this and there's a part of them going, no, I want to learn to moderate. I want to be able to have
Yeah,
cake at my daughter's wedding or whatever, like, or sometimes have something on a special occasion, and maybe you can. And maybe at some point you decide that you can't, and that's okay, but it's your journey, it's your truth. No one's trying to take anything away from you, but it's just helpful to understand that if you're in the later stages,
yeah,
there's a kind of peace.
yeah. If you understand the neurobiology of it, then you might be willing to buy into the fact that you are playing with fire if you pick up again. And because I don't think that things like there's a hypersensitivity that continues even into sobriety, long-term sobriety. And then the danger is that I'd love to see more work on this. But it's been my clinical experience, and maybe you can corroborate with me here, that each time a relapse happens, it gets harder to get back on board. It's a little bit like once you've lost weight, if there's weight regain, it's harder to lose weight again. It's like you're almost training the body that this thing is no longer working. So you can say to the person, okay, we can do some experimentation, but first of all, if you're feeling good now, is that occasional piece of cake or whatever it is, birthday thing, is it worth taking the chance, first of all? And if it is, why? Why is that so important to threaten your sobriety? But then also to say, look, if you do find that you can't have a piece of cake, it is going to be a little harder to get back on board. Haven't you found that?
Mm-hmm.
Third relapse,
Absolutely.
fourth relapse, it's harder. We see that in addiction in general. That I know that I think that the rule of thumb now is it takes about 10 relapses until a food addict finally gets it. But each relapse is more demoralizing, and if you can go with the first one or the second one of success, go for it, because it's going to be your easiest one. And that's not because of you. There's a neurobiological process that's happening. Yeah.
I'm shocked by the number 10. I must have had hundreds of relapses.
Oh, really? Yeah. But that could have been because you were also in a time when, like, I'm talking about people who are aware that they should stop. You probably weren't entirely convinced. Like I heard you saying a few minutes ago, it's been 3 months. I should be able to have some now. But you wouldn't do that now, and you wouldn't coach somebody else to say, okay, it's been 3 months. Why don't you give it a shot? But we didn't have that. We had to actually realize that truth. So
Yeah.
maybe once you realize that truth, it might be 20 minutes.
I still think I was a chronic relapser, but yes. Yeah, like no one's going to say, oh, I've given up cigarettes for 3 months, and someone's going to come and say, oh, it's been 3 months. You should just have one with me. Like no
Oh,
one's going to do that.
yeah, that's such a good example. Most people get that, maybe because they're previous smokers. I knew. I mean, I used to smoke, and I knew that when I quit, there was no way I was going to have one. Just no way I would have one, because I knew that it would just make me a smoker again. Why can't we see that with sugar? Because sugar and tobacco are very similar in their addictive patterns.
Right. And I think this is where the longer I coach in this space and the longer I walk my own journey of recovery, the more I appreciate how trauma's tied in with this, and the emotional eating piece, and how it really is the way that if it wasn't this, it would have been something else that I found. Because underneath my addiction and my use and abuse of food and ultra-processed foods was an inability to drop into my inner world, to be able to sort of meet and greet emotions, to be able to sort of access my self energy. I didn't know how to do it. Why would I? I had sugar.
Yeah.
It always worked. It always made me feel better, gave me energy, took the edge off things, raised my dopamine, my serotonin, I just felt great. Until you hit a wall and then you stop feeling great. But I missed out on decades of skill building around learning how to self-regulate and co-regulate. And so all of a sudden you put your phone down and all your stuff comes up and you look at it and you're like, what the hell? I better go back to the food because I don't know how to meet that.
It's so typical across the board with addictions. People who stop drinking alcohol, they realize that their own coping, their mental, their emotional being is like as an adolescent. They essentially have to grow up. It's partly why people will say about the 12-step program that it helps a person grow up. It gives them the tools that they didn't learn when they were in adolescence. So whatever way you do it, with a coach or with 12-step or whatever, you do have to learn how to grow up, or like you said, develop those tools that we should have learned then. And we have to work a little harder, because the window period for learning those tools was as an adolescence, and now that window period is closed. It doesn't mean you can't learn them, but they won't come so intuitive to you as they would have been.
Yeah, I would even go early childhood. Yeah. Like I would say that insecure attachments,
yes.
Right? That I would say my deepest wounding was probably very early, weeks, months, years.
Yeah.
An insecure attachment. And so, but the beautiful thing is I actually don't. I bristle as you say the word growing up. It's true. But I feel like I don't want to grow up, because there's a part of me that's still waiting for someone to come and pick me up and rock me and cradle me and tell me everything's going to be okay and I'm right here and right. But the beautiful thing is that it's us that can do that for ourselves, and it doesn't feel like growing up to me. It feels like a deepening a self-intimacy. It's the way our food becomes the way into not just a sober life, but a life that there's no way in our wildest imagination we can imagine that we could have. And thank God for our food addiction or our struggles with food, wherever you fall on the spectrum or continuum, from a user, abuser to addict.
Yeah.
When we pay attention to what happens when we sort of put down the food and what comes up and what's possible for the kind of richness of life that comes in, it's like the best thing ever that we're on the path of recovery, because what we'll discover on the other side is so worth it. Yeah, it's like the whole underworld. There's I'm reading the most fascinating book right now. I don't even know if I want to say it out loud because I think it would freak people out, but I'll tell you off the camera. But there's this beautiful passage where the guy's talking about, when you go out at night on a summer night and you look up at this big vast sky and all the stars, and you just have this sense of wonder. It's the same on the inside. The inner world is the exact same, and there's this depth and these layers. But when we're in addictions, we're cut off from going in.
Yeah.
There's such a mess in there, and there's so much fear of the feelings, so much, right? And we get to now drop in and discover this awesome inner world. And anyways,
there's actually a meditation that's called child mind, beginner's mind, which is how to see the world as if it's the first time you saw it.
Oh, yes.
And
Yeah.
and it is like a child. And you use the word wonder, and if you think about it, dopamine, which has been skewed and abused, and that is essentially the whole mechanism of this addiction paradigm, the neuroadaptation is dopamine. What is dopamine truly introduced to us as a child is wonderment. Everything is new. Everything is a wonder. And you can't feel wonder anymore because it's been totally, that's the dopamine that's been abused. And what you're actually saying is, I want to be able to feel the pure taste of what true dopamine should feel like.
Oh, that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, let's put down the fake stuff, the
Yeah,
fake dopamine pet, right?
exactly.
Oh, you know, it's one of my favorite quotes. I hope I get this right. Something like, it, addiction is an attempt to have a spiritual experience, but it's knocking on the wrong door, or
Yeah.
it went to the wrong address.
Yeah, that's a good one too. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it went to the wrong
Yeah,
address.
it went
It's
to
like,
that
oops.
stupid food industry. Yeah. But really, when we talk about recovery, we want to recover that experience because it was given to us by God or the universe or evolution, who knows what. But we are born with a birthright to feel dopamine in its trueness, which in its wonderment. And how do we get that back? Well, we want to get rid of the hijackers, first of all. I'm sorry to say it is abstinence. Because even with moderation, if you're taking that big bully that's going to rob it all, your wonderment is gone because it's all been taken, sucked up by the big bully through whatever food it is. So anyway, get rid of the big bully and then apply some kind of technique like the Buddhist beginner's mind or some other kind of practice where you just experience, yeah, true dopamine, curiosity at the slightest thing. That's why people like kids because they get to see the world again.
Yes.
Child's eyes.
Yes, you can feel their joy and their wonderment and their openness and delight in life, and absolutely.
Yeah.
So bottom line is, if you're on the spectrum, if you think you might be a user, abuser, or probably abuser or addict, you're not alone. It's okay. We're not giving up anything of value. It just feels that way.
We're just recovering. We're redistributing it.
Rediscovering it somewhere else. Better address.
Yeah, we're putting it back to the address it was meant to be. Mm-hmm. Right? It's been going to the wrong address all this time.
You're knocking on the door and you're opening it up, and it's this vast, dark, like, no, it's not a kingdom of joy. Where can we find your article?
Well, okay, it's easily found on the internet because it was published in a online journal. So if you just type in Vera Tarman stages of food addiction, I can't remember the name of the journal. That's good. Journal of Metabolic Health, I think it's called.
Okay.
Yeah, you can easily find it there.
Okay, great. And I think I'll stick it in our summit package as well, so it's handy for people to find. And wonderful. Is there any final words you'd like to share today, Dr. Tarman?
Well, I hope that we have discussed the concept of abstinence well enough to say that if you want to go back and recover what we are given at the beginning and not need anything else, food or drugs or work or internet, but just go back to what we want, then you don't want to have you don't want to live with the hijacker. If you're okay with that and it's going to rob you from that and you can just live and manage, okay. Certainly that's a fine way to go for the time being so that we don't scare you. But whatever way, I'd like to leave the message of hope that when you get the abstinence piece and you get the support, this is where the coaching and the groups and the summits and the information and the community, because there is a food addiction community growing as we speak, which is wonderful. And you are part of that, Florence, with all of your work. That when you get that, which you need to get the abstinence piece, there is a place of relief and joy that is free. It's part of us that you can reattain. It takes a little bit of work, a few weeks of abstinence and support, but you'll get to the other side and you'll be happy. You'll love the food that you should have loved from the beginning if you didn't eat that crappy stuff. And you'll also have a weight that you feel much better with if you're struggling with a weight, which is why we don't want to focus on weight, because you're gonna miss the boat on so much other stuff. That's just a great side effect. So there is hope. That's what I would like the message to be. That if you really get this message and get the support to act it out, you will be in a place where many of us, and I know, Florence, that you've talked about it many times, are just so much happier now and content. Yeah. And vibrant. Yes.
Right. Join us. That's all I have to say.
Yes.
Join us on the path, whatever recovery looks like for you.
Yes.
Just join us on the path. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Tarman.
Thank you for asking me again.